I came home to a house that wasn't mine anymore. Not in the way people say that after a long trip, that strange feeling of jet lag mixing with familiar walls. I mean, I came home, unlocked the front door with my key, and a stranger opened it from the inside, before I could even push it open. She was maybe 30, wearing a housecoat, holding a mug of coffee, and staring at me like I was the one who didn't belong. I froze on my own doorstep. "Can I help you?" she said. Those 3 words. I keep going back to them. Can I help you? At my own front door. In front of the house I had bought with 7 years of savings. In the neighborhood I had chosen street by street. In the city I had come back to after 14 months working in Calgary. I said, "I think there's been a mistake." She said, "Are you a realtor?" I said, "No. I own this house." The way her expression changed the confusion. The slight stepping back, that was the moment I understood that something had gone very, very wrong. And my first thought, before the anger, before anything else, I was my sister knew about this. My name is Claire. I'm 31 years old. I'm a licensed paralegal. And for the past 3 years, I have specialized in real estate and civil litigation at a mid-size firm in Toronto. I know property law the way some people know their own kitchen by instinct. By muscle memory. By the particular sound things make when they go wrong. I say this not to brag. I say this because the person who decided to steal from me apparently forgot what I do for a living. Or maybe she just assumed that love makes people blind. She wasn't entirely wrong about that. It took me longer than it should have to see clearly. Because the person who did this was my older sister. Danielle. Let me tell you how it started. Or rather, let me tell you how it started for me. Because by the time I found out, it had already been finished for months, 14 months earlier. I had taken a contract position in Calgary. My firm had a client with a large commercial property dispute, and they needed someone on the ground who could handle document, review, and liaise with local counsel. The pay was exceptional. The experience would move my career forward in ways that staying in Toronto couldn't. I said yes. Before I left, I had a conversation with Danielle. She's 4 years older than me. And at that point, she was between jobs. She'd left her position at a marketing agency in the fall and was still figuring out her next step. She asked if she could stay at my house while I was gone. Just to have a stable address. She said. Just to save on rent while she sorted herself out. I said yes to that too. I had one condition. She was not to touch anything related to the house, the mortgage, the property tax account, the insurance. Any of it. All of that was on automatic payments through my bank. All she had to do was live there and not break anything. She said, "Obviously. It's your house, Claire." I gave her a spare key. I set up a recurring e-transfer to cover utilities. I flew to Calgary. For the first 6 months, everything seemed fine. We texted. She sent me photos of the backyard in the snow. She told me she was doing some freelance consulting work. That she was feeling better. That she'd been going to yoga. We weren't the closest sisters in the world. There had always been a slight edge between us. The kind that builds when one sibling seems to have things figured out before the other, but I wasn't worried. I trusted her. Around month 8. The text slowed down. I told myself she was busy. I told myself she was finally getting back on her feet. I told myself a lot of things. I flew home on a Thursday in March. My contract had ended 2 weeks early because the dispute settled. I hadn't told Danielle the exact date I was coming back because I'd been in back-to-back closing meetings and honestly hadn't gotten around to it. I figured I'd surprise her. We'd order pizza. She'd help me decompress. It would be nice. Instead, a woman in a housecoat opened my door and asked if I was a realtor. I stood on that porch for probably 40 seconds before I could form a sentence. Then I asked the woman her name was Patricia. She told me. Very politely. Very carefully how long she had been living there. She said she had moved in 6 weeks ago. I asked if she had purchased the property. She said yes. I asked how much she had paid. She said she'd rather not discuss that without her husband present, and could I please tell her what this was about. I told her I believed there had been a fraudulent transaction. I told her I was a paralegal. I told her I was very sorry for the shock, but I needed to make some calls. I gave her my card. She took it with a hand that had started to tremble. And I stepped off the porch, walked to my rental car, and sat there for a moment, staring at the steering wheel. Then I called Danielle. She picked up on the second ring. I said, "Where are you?" She said, "Hey, are you back? How was the drive?" "Did you?" I said. "Where are you?" "Danielle." A pause. "Then I'm at Mom's." I said, "Why is there a woman living in my house?" Another pause. Longer. And in that pause, I heard something I will never forget. A very quiet exhale. Like someone who had been waiting a long time for a particular shoe to drop. She said, "Claire." "I can explain." I said. "Start." She didn't. Not really. What she gave me was a version of an explanation, something about how she had been struggling financially. How the freelance work had dried up. How she had borrowed against the house, just temporarily, to cover some debts. She used the phrase borrowed against the way people use it when they want to avoid saying what they actually did. I said, "You sold my house." "Danielle." She said. "It wasn't like that. I had power of attorney." I said. "You had a limited power of attorney for mail collection. That document does not authorize real property transactions. You know that. Or you would know it if you'd read it." She went quiet. I said, "Who helped you? You couldn't have done this alone." She said she didn't want to talk about it over the phone. I told her she was going to want to start talking very soon. Because in about 24 hours I was going to be at my firm pulling every document connected to this transaction. And she could either tell me what happened now, or explain it to someone in a considerably less forgiving setting. She hung up. I sat in the car for another minute. Then I drove to a hotel. Checked in. Opened my laptop. And started working. Here's what I found over the next 72 hours. And I want to be specific because the details matter not just for the story, but because this is exactly the kind of thing that can happen to anyone who trusts the wrong person with access to their life. Danielle had not acted alone. She had found a notary, not a lawyer. A notary who had agreed to witness a fraudulent transfer document. The document used the limited power of attorney I had given her, stretched far beyond its actual scope, with an attached addendum that purported to expand its authority to include real property sales. The addendum was forged. I know this because the language in it did not match any standard Ontario addendum format. The date stamp was inconsistent with the original document's notarization date. And the commissioner's seal was from a different province than where the original was signed. These are the kinds of things you notice when you spend 3 years reviewing real estate documents. The property had been listed quietly, not on MLS, but through a private sale network. It sold for $614. Ling ling ling. My house was worth closer to $720. 000 at the time, based on comparable sales in the neighborhood. Danielle had taken a lowball offer. Probably because a private sale through informal channels asks fewer questions. Patricia and her husband had paid in good faith. They had no idea. Danielle had received the funds by wire transfer into an account I had never seen before. An account I later learned that she had opened specifically for this purpose, 8 months prior. In the weeks after the sale, she had paid off approximately $38. 0 inches, personal debt. Put a deposit on a condo rental in Mississauga. And transferred just over $40. 000 to a joint account she held with someone named Marcus. Marcus, I discovered, was a man she had been seeing for about a year. He was not someone our family had ever met. He did not appear to have stable employment. He did appear to have a history of small claims judgments against him for unpaid loans. When I found Marcus, I understood the full picture. I called my mother that night. I want to be honest about this part because it was the hardest part harder, in some ways, than the legal battle that followed. My mother knew, not everything, not the details, but she had known that Danielle had done something with the house, as she put it, and she had known for at least 2 months. She had chosen not to tell me because she believed she actually told me this. That if I found out before Danielle had a chance to sort things out, it would destroy the family. I said, "Mom, someone is living in my house." She said, "I know. And it's a terrible situation. But Danielle is your sister." And she was struggling. And you were doing so well, I said. She committed fraud. She forged documents and sold my home. My mother said. You have to understand what she was going through. I have thought about that sentence many times since. You have to understand what she was going through. As if what Danielle was going through canceled out what she had done. As if my understanding was owed in advance. Without condition. Simply because we shared a last name. I said. I do understand what she was going through. And I'm still calling the police. My mother started crying. I stayed on the line until she stopped. Then I told her I loved her and I hung up, and I filed a report with the Toronto Police Service the next morning. The following weeks were some of the strangest of my life. I was staying in a hotel, working remotely, and simultaneously acting as the most informed witness, in my own case. My firm was aware of the situation. I had disclosed it to my supervising partner immediately, and while I couldn't formally represent myself, I had colleagues who could. And they did. The criminal file moved faster than I expected. The notary, when contacted, initially denied any involvement. Then our team produced the inconsistencies in the addendum. Then we produced the wire transfer records. Then we produced the timeline, showing that the notary's seal number corresponded to a seal that had been reported lost 18 months prior, meaning someone had used a compromised seal, which is its own category of offense. The notary retained a lawyer, and within 3 weeks had agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for consideration on sentencing. Danielle was charged with fraud over $5. Ling ling ling. Forgery. And uttering forged documents. Marcus was charged as a knowing beneficiary of proceeds of crime. The charges were laid on a Tuesday. I found out by text from the detective assigned to the file. I was sitting in a coffee shop on King Street when I got that message. I read it twice. Then I ordered another coffee and sat there for a while. Not really feeling what I thought I would feel. Here's the part that surprised people. When I told them later, Patricia and her husband did not have to pay for the house twice. This is the thing that most people don't know about Canadian real estate. And it's important. Ontario has a land titles assurance fund, a provincially administered fund, specifically designed for situations where a registered owner suffers loss because of fraud or forgery in the land registry system. Patricia and her husband had title insurance as well, which provided an additional layer of protection. After a process that took several months and required documentation, I was well positioned to help compile. The fraudulent transfer was set aside, and title was restored to me. Patricia and her husband were compensated for their losses and associated costs. It was not fast. It was not painless. There were months of back and forth, of forms and affidavits and waiting. But the system worked. I want to say that clearly, because I know a lot of people hear these stories and assume the victim just gets left holding the bag. That is not always what happens. If you know the mechanisms that exist and how to use them, what I did not get back as easily was the equity difference, the gap between what Danielle had sold the house for and what it was actually worth. And the costs I had incurred. That became part of a civil claim, which is still working its way through the system as I write this. The family piece was harder than the legal piece. It always is. My mother and I did not speak for 4 months after the charges were laid. She felt I had gone too far. She used that phrase with me twice. And both times I asked her what the appropriate distance was. How far exactly was I allowed to go when someone stole $614,000 worth of property from me using forged documents? She didn't have an answer for that. I think she just wanted me to find one that was shorter. My aunt, my mother's sister, called me about 6 weeks into the silence to tell me that I was tearing the family apart, and that Danielle had made a mistake, but she was family. I told my aunt that I respected her opinion, and that I was going to proceed with what I believed was the right course of action. I did not tell her that I had also quietly confirmed, through a contact at my firm, that Danielle had forged a second document, a letter purportedly from me, authorizing Danielle to act on my behalf in an unrelated financial matter, which she had used to close a line of credit in my name. I kept that information because I needed it. I released it when the time was right. There is a moment I keep coming back to. About 3 months after everything started, I was at a family dinner. My mother had called a truce of sorts. She wanted everyone to sit down together, she said, and talk about a path forward. I went because I genuinely wanted to understand what that path looked like from her perspective. Danielle was there. She looked tired. She looked like someone who had spent several months discovering that the consequences of her choices were, in fact, real. Marcus was not there. They had apparently separated. The condo rental had ended when she could no longer afford it. My mother had cooked a full dinner. There was a moment early in the evening, when the three of us were in the kitchen together, my mother at the stove, Danielle setting the table, me leaning against the counter, and it felt almost ordinary. It felt like any Sunday from 10 years ago. Then Danielle looked at me and said, "I really did think I was going to pay it back before you found out." I looked at her for a moment. I said, "I know you did." She said, "I'm sorry." "Claire," I said, "I know you are." And I meant both of those things. I believed she was sorry. I believed she had told herself a story in which this was temporary, manageable, fixable, before it became real. I also believed that none of that changed what had happened, or what I was obligated to do about it. She said, "Are you ever going to forgive me?" I thought about that question seriously before I answered. Because she deserved a serious answer, I said, "I think so. Eventually. But forgiveness and trust are different things. Danielle. I can work toward one. The other one is gone." She nodded. She didn't argue. I think some part of her knew that was the most honest thing I could offer. My mother cried a little at dinner. We ate. We didn't resolve anything. But we were in the same room. And that was something. The criminal case is scheduled for a plea hearing in the fall. Danielle has a lawyer. The likely outcome, based on what I understand of cases with similar fact patterns, and a cooperating co-accused, is a conditional sentence with restitution terms. Whether the restitution is ever fully recovered is a separate question. I moved back into my house in October. Patricia had been careful with it, careful in the way people are with things they know they may not get to keep. She left the place clean. She left a note on the kitchen counter that said she was glad everything had worked out for me, and that she hoped whoever had done this faced what they deserved. I kept the note. I have been asked many times since whether I regret reporting my sister to the police, whether a different choice, a private settlement, a repayment plan, some family arrangement that kept things out of the courts would have been better. I understand why people ask that. I have asked myself the same thing. Here is what I come back to. Danielle did not make a mistake. A mistake is an error in judgment made without full information. Danielle spent 8 months constructing a deliberate process, a separate bank account, a forged addendum, a complicit notary, a private sale network, a plan to be finished before I returned. That is not a mistake. That is a choice. Made over and over again. Across many months. With full knowledge of what she was doing and who she was doing it to, I did not report her because I was angry. Though I was. I did not report her because I wanted to punish her. Though there are consequences she will face. I reported her because what she did was a crime. And because the system that allows people to own property to actually securely own property, to be safe from having the ground pulled out from under you, only functions if fraud is treated as fraud. She gambled that my love for her would be bigger than my commitment to that principle. She was wrong. But I don't think she knew that until she heard my voice on the phone, that Thursday afternoon, asking where she was. If you are reading this and you have someone in your life with access to your home, your financial accounts, any document with your signature, go check. Right now. Before you finish this, log into your provincial land registry and confirm your title. Check that your power of attorney documents have not been altered. Make sure your property tax and mortgage accounts have not had unauthorized address changes. It takes 20 minutes, and I am telling you from experience. 20 minutes now is worth everything later. I am back in my house. I am working. I am still a paralegal who specializes in real estate and civil litigation. My sister made the mistake of stealing from someone who knew exactly where to look,